I sold my soul to the Goatman. Part 2. The cold rain splashed against the window as the private detective sat in his office drinking his coffee. It was early, 5-something in the morning. The glow of the distant streetlights just showed how empty the streets are at such an hour, almost as if the rest of the world and the people that were on it had disappeared. Detective Slater sat and sipped while going over his case files of the current ongoing cases. The current one he was working on was about some Boy Scouts that narrowly escaped some encounter with the Skinwalker. It appeared some of the Boy Scouts and the Scout leaders weren't so lucky. He liked the early mornings in the office. It gave him time to think and got him out of the house, which he needed. "Someone's coming," the voice in his head said, alerting him to the client that was not yet in view. Slater lowered the case files that had graphic photos of the crime scene. The voice, which Detective Slater called Mr. White for various reasons, stammered. "He's being followed by something, and it's not human." Slater's hairs on the back of his neck stood up, alerting him to the danger. "What is it? Is it one of your type, maybe?" "No. This thing is not from this dimension. I've never felt anything like this before." Before Slater and Mr. White could converse more, the door bursted open and entered an injured man who quickly shut the door and sat in front of it. Please help me," the man said, exhausted and in pain. The shirt was covered with various substances, but the most notable was blood. Slater got up and walked over to the man that continued to bleed all over his floor. "Who's chasing you?" Slater demanded. "I don't know how else to describe him, but I must kill him." Slater glanced out the window and saw the silhouette of a horned beast standing by one of the distant light posts. "That's him," Mr. White said. "You're gonna need me." "You can't let him get me, or time will reset," the dying man on the floor pleaded. "I have died thousands of times. I've been able to evade him for this long. You have to help me kill him." Slater looked down for what could have been only a few moments, but the next thing he knew, the horned beast bursted into the office, knocking back Slater. The figure was now in plain view of Slater, and he could see that the horned beast resembled some type of goat. The beast was feral-looking, due to its filth, but something about it let Mr. White and Slater know that this being was somewhat intelligent. The eyes were red, and it had the body of a large man. Scars covered its body in a way that almost looked ornamental, as if it was wearing symbols and shapes on purpose. The Goatman bent down and picked up the potential client by the throat and lifted him in the air. The Goatman then grabbed with his other arm one of the dangling legs and pulled the head and leg in the opposite direction, causing the body to tear in half, spilling out all the entrails onto the floor. The Goatman then dropped the man on the floor and looked over at Slater and began to walk towards him. Before the Goatman reached Slater, the most bizarre thing happened. The scene changed, and Slater was no longer in his office, but rather his empty home, and he was fast asleep. Slater was in his bed just a few hours before the encounter with the Goatman, unaware of what just happened. Time had reset since the Goatman killed the man, which was repeating a loop each time he died. Slater was unaware of what just happened. In fact, Slater was fast asleep for the few hours that he got each night. Mr. White, however, was completely aware of what just happened. The time loop only affects people's memory within the realm. Mr. White, however, didn't abide by the rules of this dimension, and he certainly wasn't a person. "Wake up," Mr. White whispered to Slater, which a groggy eye opened. "What is it now?" Slater groaned. Mr. White responded, "Something is happening. Time just reset a few hours back. I think it's the Goatman." Slater got up and got ready and went into the office even earlier than before. Mr. White did his best to brief him on what he could about the time loop before everything reset.
There is a small window in which the Goatman doesn't appear. We need to get the man out into safety before the Goatman can reset the time loop. Get your truck ready, and as soon as he appears, we need to leave. From there, I can instruct you on how to kill a Goatman.
Slater parked his truck near the entrance of the office and waited for the man to appear. The light rain and the dark night made it difficult to see much. Visibility was quite low. Slater was struggling with what little sleep he had, but Mr. White made sure to keep him awake. Just around an hour of waiting, a wounded man could be seen hobbling towards the office, in which Slater jumped into action. He turned the truck on and rolled the window down and told the man to get in. The man quickly hobbled in the passenger seat, this time slightly less wounded than before, but still injured. Before the Goatman could arrive, Slater put the truck into drive and drove off into the night. Mr. White gave instructions on where to drive. He was leading them away from the city and into the countryside.
There is a place that holds ancient information on these types of creatures and how to kill them,
Mr. White whispered. They continued to drive with no issues. It would seem that the man's problems were far behind him. Mr. White continued to give instructions to Slater as he drove into what was now a heavily wooded area. The darkness added to the brisk air of uneasiness. After 2 hours of driving and no sight of the Goatman, Mr. White instructed Slater to pull over onto this dirt road, out in the middle of nowhere. The dirt road was terribly managed, but thankfully it wasn't terribly long, but the thick forest and the darkness made it feel like they were in another realm of reality. Much like the scene in Snow White when she escapes the hunter, the two men could feel eyes and see shadows dance just before they could focus. The forest felt like it was possessed by multiple spirits. Not like the spirits were protecting the forest, but more so that they were condemned to haunt it, in a place that no one should be. It was still dark when they eventually arrived at the mountain face that had a small cave opening that led inside. Slater parked the truck with the headlights facing the cave. Outside of the cave were small bony trinkets and sticks bound with old string. It was clear that there was some type of intelligent being living inside. Mr. White whispered,
"Inside is a witch that can help the man. There's a good chance that the witch might kill him, but we need her help nonetheless. Slater, once you go inside, I can't transform or speak to you because of the trinkets guarding the cave. You'll be on your own."
Slater and the client looked at each other skeptically. The cave gave off an aura of despair and hopelessness. However, they knew that time was not on their side. They exited the truck and Slater pulled out his .357 Magnum revolver that he kept under the seat of his truck and grabbed a flashlight from the center console. Slater led the way and the client followed. "What's inside?" the man asked with clear concern. "I'm not completely sure. Hopefully, an ally." The small cave opening had a long, narrow entrance that winded into the mountain. The further they went in, the more trinkets and candles they began to see. The candles were of a curious craftsmanship, and that despite being lit, they seemed to have pulled the light away from the flashlight, making the cave even darker. Slater noticed this and realized that the candles only worked if they were the only light source, so he turned off his flashlight and continued. After a few minutes of trepidatious searching inside, they arrived to a type of atrium containing all types of wondrous horrors and dark magic. Magic neither of them, despite their different backgrounds, had ever seen. They began to hear a laughter, coming from one of the dark corners of the cave, but neither could see the source. That is until an old woman revealed herself, out of thin air, as if she removed some type of invisible barrier. She had long white hair that looked scattered and frayed like the mane of a wild horse. She was also not wearing any clothing, and her mouth was filled with blackened teeth.
"It appears that fate has brought me two lovely vessels,"
the old woman hissed.
"But neither of you are ordinary, are you? One has the presence of the white Wendigo. Well, that was before entering the cave. And the other I can tell reeks of dealing with Elikazul, or as you may know him as the Goatman. I know your thoughts and I can grant you what you want, but as for you both know, dealing with dark magic comes with a price. For you, Slater, I can rid you of your friend. All I ask is that when you finally feel the need to die, allow me to eat you to gain his spirit. You'll have to be alive, of course, when I eat you, but you don't need to answer now. And as for you..."
The old woman paused and walked up to the client and began to inspect him with a bony finger and grabbed his face.
"You'll need ash from his world. Once you have that, you can apply the ash onto any type of weapon which will kill him. I must remind you, if you apply the ash to, say, a gun, it will actually have to be the bullet itself. I can give you the ash for free. However, it might interest you that the time loop will just restart. To stop the time loop, I will need to perform a ritual, which will come at a hefty price."
"Name your price, witch," the client demanded, knowing fully well it was not going to be good.
"Typically the ritual requires an organ of the participant, but since it's Elikazul, his power requires more than just one. I'll need 2 organs from you, but you have to give them to me."
She hands him a rusty blade and begins to laugh hysterically. The client looks over at Slater and shakes his head. "What do I do? What do you count as an organ? Can I just give you like an ear?"
"The fleshy outer part doesn't count. You'll have to give me the inner parts of the skull as well."
The client thought for a minute. "What about a tongue? Would that work?" The witch nodded.
"I'll accept a tongue," she grinned.
The client thought again. "Okay, second organ. What should I do?" Fine, I'll do an eye."
"Excellent choice."
The client took the rusty blade and hesitated for a second. He placed it on his face just under his eye and began to breathe quickly. With a quick motion and a loud shriek, the eye eventually made its way out of the skull, but still dangled from his face. The client dropped the blade out of pain and fell to the ground. The witch quickly hobbled over to the client and grasped the dangling eye with her dirty hands and pulled it from his skull. The client let out an even louder scream and flailed in pain. The witch took the eye over to a cauldron and placed it inside while adding other terrible ingredients.
"One more organ to complete the ritual."
The client writhed on the ground some more, grasping the gaping hole in his face. He felt around on the cave floor for the blade, which he eventually found. The client grabbed his tongue with one hand and pulled it as far out as he could, and sawed away at it with the other, at the tender flesh that dangled from his mouth. His mouth filled with blood and the client screamed, but eventually he parted the tongue from his head. He threw the tongue at the witch and fell on the ground. His face was bleeding from both his eye and his mouth. He tried to say something, but wasn't able to, so he just mumbled nonsense. The witch took the tongue and placed it inside the cauldron and began to stir. A light began to emit from the cauldron and a low hum could be heard. The witch began to chant for a few seconds before a loud boom was heard and the light from the cauldron went out.
"There you go. The time loop has been stopped."
She tossed the client a small vial of ash, which the client dropped initially, but didn't break. The client picked up the vial and looked around. He was looking for a weapon. Slater grabbed his .357 handgun and handed the pistol over to him. The client grabbed the gun awkwardly and struggled to release the cylinder housing all the bullets. He finally got it to open and took out a single bullet and opened the vial. The ash was only enough for one bullet, but he covered it in ash and put it back in the gun. The two left the cave and made their way outside. The client was still bleeding, but not as much now. Slater had to help the client work his way over to the truck and get inside. Mr. White's voice came back to Slater once he exited the cave.
"What did she tell you?"
he asked. It wasn't important, Slater lied, as he entered the truck. The two pulled out of the forest dirt road and eventually found a paved road. It was still dark out, but the sun would soon start to rise in a few hours. The client was trying his best to cover the wounds in his face, and Slater drove silently.
"He's close,"
Mr. White whispered,
"but I don't know where."
The headlights quickly came upon what appeared to be a turned-over vehicle, blocking the road completely. Slater slowed the truck and could see that there was a person trying to crawl away from the wreckage. The person that was crawling was missing their lower half and was screaming. The client started to mumble something loudly, and he got out of the truck. The man crawling shouted to the client that something was out here and that we needed to help him. Slater was starting to get out of the truck, and Mr. White began to shout,
"Don't get out, Slater. He sees you."
Slater stayed inside the truck while the client tried his best to help the wounded man. The client shouted over and waved as if he wanted Slater to get out and help, but Slater knew better.
"This isn't your fight,"
Mr. White whispered. Just then, a dark figure began to approach the client from the nearby tree line, but the client was preoccupied with the injured man.
"Hey!"
Slater yelled, but before the client could realize what was happening, the Goatman quickly closed the gap and had the client by the throat. Slater anticipated this and floored the gas with the truck aimed at the Goatman. Before the Goatman could kill the client, the truck collided violently with the Goatman and the client. The client was thrown from the demon's grasp, but the force of the collision still caused some collateral damage. The Goatman was flown back into the initial crash and was mangled. Its limbs were contorted and began to seep a dark liquid that Slater could only assume to be its blood. The once red eyes of the beast were no longer red, but now a more enchanting green. The truck in which Slater was driving was no longer operable. After the truck collided, it continued past and crashed into the side embankment of the road and tipped on the driver's side. The crash jolted Slater and disoriented him, causing him to struggle exiting his vehicle. The Goatman then began to crawl, with each movement slowly reconstructing the beast's mangled body. The client looked on in horror as the demonic beast slowly inched itself towards him. The client was not too far away, and there lay the .357 with the ash-covered bullet. He tried to move, but soon found that his body was in a similar state of damage. However, he was barely able to hobble to his feet. The beast continued to reconstruct each part, making it easier to move, and it began to make ground on the client. Slater kicked the windshield in hopes to making his escape and help aid the client, but the windshield proved to resist the weakened kick by the detective. The detective's ears were ringing, and his head had clearly experienced a concussion, making his thoughts and the whispers of Mr. White drowned out by the pain. The client hobbled over to the gun and picked it up. However, at this time, when he finally reached the gun, the beast was almost completely healed. The beast was still a good distance away, but once healed, it would be able to close any distance with ease. The client aimed the weapon as best he could, but struggled. His aim was greatly impaired due to losing his eye, but also from being tossed from the crash. This was it. This would be the only time the client could finally finish what he started so long ago, and no longer be tormented by this demonic beast. The Goatman stood upright, his eyes changing from dull green back to a bright red. The Goatman looked at the client, knowing fully well he had visited the witch. Seeing he was missing an eye, the beast knew that she must have performed the ritual to stop the time loop. For the first time, the beast had a look of vulnerability about it. It was no longer this terribly bold creature, but now it actually looked like it was contemplating. "Look, I'll make you a deal. Leave me alone and we can both walk away, the client whimpered. But the creature didn't say anything. It just stood there. I have an ash bullet. I can kill you, the client screamed. The beast began to reveal a twisted and toothy smile.
Only one?
It replied. The client realized his mistake and knew that he just showed his hand. Slater was finally able to kick out the windshield and watch the showdown between the two. The client aimed the weapon as best he could, and at the same time the creature bursted at the client with a terribly great speed. Before the beast reached the client, a shot rang out and the two collided. There was a brief stillness in the air. The client and the beast locked eyes and were face to face. The beast only muttered 2 words to the client, but he already knew.
You missed.
There was nothing that Slater could do but watch helplessly as the Goatman carried the client off into the woods.